I am going to read a piece called 150 Years Since the Critique of the Gotha Program by Michael Roberts. I'm going to say Gotha because I think it's closer to right than my Goethe. Me mispronouncing this word, even though I have some knowledge of German, has become a running joke. But I'm going to try to pronounce it close to correctly today. Michael Roberts is a Marxist economist that I like enough. I read him regularly, and I wanted to see what he had to say about this. We've already gone over Lars Lee's understanding, so it might not hurt to hit this one. 150 Years Since the Critique of the Gotha Program by Michael Roberts. The critique was a document based on a letter by Marx written in early May 1875 to the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany, SDAP, with whom Marx and Friedrich Engels were in close association. The letter is named after the Gotha Program, a proposed manifesto for a forthcoming party congress that was to take place in the town of Gotha. At the congress, the SDAP, the Eisenknockers, planned to merge with the General German Workers' Association, the ADAV, who were followers of Ferdinand Lassalle, to form a unified party. I've gone over this a million times, but nonetheless. Karl Marx's critique of the Gotha Program was written around 150 years ago this week. And this will be released a few weeks after this week, but it's still within the year. It provides us with Marx's most detailed pronouncements on revolutionary strategy, the meaning of the term, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the nature of the period of transition between capitalism and communism, and the importance of internationalism. The Gotha Congress, May 1875. A socialist activist and politician, Lassalle viewed the state as the expression of the people, and that as a construct of any social class. And that's one of the big differences between Marx and Lassalle. One of many. He adopted a form of state socialism and rejected class struggle by the workers through trade unions. Instead, he had a Malthusian theory of the iron law of wages, which argued that if wages rose above subsistence level in an economy, the population would grow and more workers would compete, forcing the wages down again. Marx and Engels had long rejected this theory of wages. See my book, Engels at 200, which is a good book, pages 40 to 42. The Eisenknockers had sent a draft program for the United Party to Marx for comment. He found the program sufficiently influenced by Lassalle and so responded with his critique. However, at the Congress held in Gotha in late May 1875 to set up the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, the program was accepted with only minor alterations. Marx's critical letter was published by Engels only much later in 1891 when the SPD declared its intentions of adopting a new program, the result being the Effort Program of 1891. Drafted by Karl Kautsky and Edward Bernstein, this program superseded the Gotha Program and was much closer to Marx's and Engels' views, although Engels did have a few critiques of it. I added the last part. In the critique, among other things, Marx attacked the Lassallean proposal for state aid rather than public ownership and the abolition of commodity production. Marx also noted there was no mention of the organization of the working class as a class. Pretty common in Marx's day to mention that, but whatever. And at this point of the utmost importance being the proletarian's true class organization and that it fights its daily battles with capital. Marx objected to the program's reference to a free people state. For Marx, the state is merely a transitional institution of which use is made in the struggle and revolution to keep down one's enemies by force. So it is utter nonsense to speak of a free people state. As soon as there was any question of freedom, the state would, as such, would cease to exist. This was and is a vital distinction between the views of Marx and Engels in the state in a post-capitalist society and the views of social democracy and of Stalinism, which talks of state socialism. I think that's fair. But I think like the Gotha program, even though it's cited by a lot of Dungists because it seems to propose, elements of bourgeois society survive in the next one, although it's not markets that survive. It seems to be time accounting, but nonetheless, 2 stages of communism. Both Marx and Engels always referred to themselves as communists to make the distinction with earlier forms of socialism. They define communism simply as a dissolution of the mode of production in the form of society based on exchange value. The most basic feature of communism and Marx's critique is the overcoming of capitalism's separation of the producer's labor from the control of production. To reverse this entails the complete decommodification of labor power, which is something that most communists have given up, to be honest with you. Communist or associated production will be planned and carried out by producers and communities themselves without a class-based intermediaries of wage labor market in the state. Take that. In the critique, Marx outlined 2 stages of communism after the capitalist mode of production has been replaced. In the first stage of communism, we have to deal with what is here. What we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from a capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the society from whose womb it emerged. So according to each individual producer receives back from society, often after deductions have been made, of exactly what he gives to it. What is given to it is his individual quantum of labor. For example, the social working day consists of the sum of the individual hours of work. The individual labor time of the individual producer is part of the social working day contributed by him, his share in it. The worker receives a certificate from society that has furnished such and such an amount of labor after deducing his labor from the common funds. And with this certificate, he draws the social stock of the means of consumption as much as the same amount of labor costs. The same amount of labor has given to society in one form, he receives in another. Since labor is always together with nature, a fundamental subsistence of wealth, notice together with nature, labor time is an important measure of the cost of wealth's production, even if exchange value is eliminated. So even in the lower stage of communism, there is no market, no exchange value, no money. Yeah, that's what the text says, yet you will be told that since some remnant of bourgeois society exists, that there's still a market, there's still exchange value, and there's still money. Because we play with words. Even when the definition is right there, people hope you don't read the entire document very closely. Sometimes you'll be mocked for insisting to read the document closely, or some socialist scholar will tell you that this document wasn't important in the first place, which is why Marx didn't release it. Which, of course, makes hay of everything that I know about Marxism and makes Lenin's whole methodology and state and revolution not make any sense. But nonetheless, people do say such a thing. During the new association's lower phase, the producers may receive paper vouchers entitling them to withdraw from the social supplies of consumer goods a quantity corresponding to their labor time. But these vouchers are not money. They do not circulate. Marx, they're not transferable. Labor certificates are like theater tickets. They are to be used once only. Moreover, Marx assumed that even in the first phase of communism, most of the total social product will not be distributed to the people according to the labor time they perform in the form of labor certificates, but deducted for the common use from the onset. There will be expanded social services, education, health services, utilities, and old age pensions that are financed by deductions from the total social product prior to the distribution amongst individuals. Hence, what the producer is deprived of in his capacity as a private individual benefits him directly or indirectly in its capacity as a member of society. It's pretty clear what that means. Such social consumption will, in Marx's view, be considerably increased in comparison with the present-day society and increases in proportion as the new society develops. And with the radical shortening of the working day, thanks to the rapid development of technology, the scope of labor certificates would be substantially narrowed over time. So the labor certificate scheme is not even a scheme that Marx wants to maintain forever. Eventually, in the higher phase of communist society, after enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but of life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of the cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety in society, inscribed on its banner, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Which, of course, probably comes from Acts. It's been used many phrases. It's not Marx's phrase, and nor is it immediate in socialism or communism. The transition. From the critique, we can also characterize a transitional economy between capitalism and towards communism. There is a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. The term dictatorship of the proletariat seems alien to democracy as used now, but for Marx and Engels, it was simply a description of the takeover of state and economy by the working class. And because it would have to suspend prior walls which benefited the bourgeois class, that's what it means. The term dictatorship of the proletariat came from the communist journalist Joseph Windemeyer, who in 1852 published an article called The Dictatorship of the Proletariat in the German language newspaper Thun Zeitung. In that year, Marx wrote to him stating, "Long before me, bourgeois historians have described the historical development of the struggle between the classes as the bourgeois economists, their economic autonomy. My own contribution was A, to show the existence of classes is merely bound up with certain historical phases in the development of production, or excuse me, 1, 2, that the class struggle is necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and 3, that the dictatorship itself constitutes no more than a transition to the abolition of all classes into a classless society." Those are pretty big names and long forgotten in Marx circles often. Capitalism may have the trappings of democracy with its somewhat blunted universal suffrage and elected leaders, and in reality, this democracy is the dictatorship of capital, the rule of finance, and the big oligarchies controlling the democratic institutions. The dictatorship of the proletariat would mean the dictatorship rule of the majority of the working people dictating to capital and not vice versa. When asked to give an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat, both Marx and Engels replied, the Paris Commune. In the 1891 postscript to the Civil War in France, an 1872 pamphlet, Engels stated, "Well and good, gentlemen, do you want to know what this dictatorship would look like? Look at the Paris Commune. That is the dictatorship of the proletariat." So that requires us to look at the Paris Commune. To avoid corruption, Engels had recommended that the commune make use of 2 expedients. In the first place, it filled all posts, administrative, judicial, and educational, by election on the basis of universal suffrage of all concerned, with the right of the same electors to recall their delegates at any time. And in the second place, all officials, high and low, were paid only the wages received by other workers. In this way, an effective barrier to place hunting and careerism was set up, even apart from the binding mandates to the delegates and representative bodies, which were also added in profusion. Engels' second principle was that the elected should not earn more than the electors. This is not only a potent anti-corruption element, it also means that the principle that the skilled workers should not own more than unskilled workers is a residue of archaic capitalist production relations. Workers are skilled either because their inherent qualities, and there is no reason to reward them for this, or because they have benefited from an educational system. In either case, there is no reason to reward them more for this. Garbage refuse collectors are just as important to society as economic professors, if not more. Those provisions were essential from the start for a worker state in transition to communism, and most important, must be a progressive withering away of the state power. Now, I read this because I think this is all basic stuff, but I see the critique of the Gotha program used to for stuff like value-added pay and differentials among workers and market socialism and Army's beliefs as officialdom. In this connection, Marx makes an essential distinction between those performing the function of capital, control and surveillance, and those who perform the function of labor, coordination and unity of the labor process. Marx makes an analogy with an orchestra where the director coordinates the musicians. Those performing the work of coordination and unity of labor process are not managers in the usual meaning. They do not oversee and police. They are not agents of capital who exploit the laborers on behalf of capital. Rather, they are members of a collective labor. Those performing the work of coordination and unity of the work processes are the opposite of managers in capitalist production relations. Basically, they're people who are put forward by merit and supported by popular vote and can be recalled. That's me adding that, but that's what is implied. Production in a transitional economy should be increasing the production of use values. That is, the goods workers themselves decide to produce in order to satisfy their needs as expressed by themselves. For example, environmental investments over arms. This requires planning and thus democratic decision process. It also requires a common ownership of the means of production, democratic decision-making in investments, and in the choice of the technique of the various labor processes that are most suited for the full development of every worker's potential. These principles are key indicators of workers' democracy making a transition to socialism and communism. Their expansion or disappearance in the case whether society is moving towards or away from socialism or communism. Now, this is interesting because this is coming from a guy who defends China more than even I do. But I think he's right here. So, I also think he's right to defend China. I just wouldn't go as far as he does. Internationalism. The dictatorship of the proletariat may begin in individual nation states, but such states cannot progress towards socialism, that is, the withering away of the state machines toward the administration of things, unless the dictatorship spread internationally into the major economies and eventually globally, just as the capitalist mode of production did. Communist production is not simply inherited from capitalism, being only to be signed into law by a newly elected socialist government. Take that, Bernstein, and like most of Jacobin magazine writers. It requires long struggles through a series of historic process, transforming circumstances and men. Among these transforming circumstances will be not only a change of distribution, but new organizations of production rather than the delivery, setting free of social forms of production of their present class character and their harmonious national and international coordination. That means the ending of imperialism, its replacement by an association of nations based on democratic planning and common ownership. Under these criteria, China is not moving towards socialism. It is a transitional economy that cannot move towards socialism because it lacks the key feature of workers' democracy as outlined in the critique, and is surrounded by imperialism. Yeah, that's kind of my line too. Actually, I that's why I talk about China being the most responsible capitalist state, full of actual socialists who want to transition to socialism. I have no reason not to believe them on that. Xi has done things to protect Deng's legacy, but he's also done things to undo elements of Deng's legacy. So yeah, it is in a trap transition, and it is in a trap transition which could eventually be reversed, as proved for the Soviet Union, meaning it could go back to capitalism fully instead of what it's doing right now, which is kind of capitalism, sort of. Capitalism and protections for the people and serious responsibilities, and they're actually better at doing capitalism than the capitalists are, but nonetheless, you know. To avoid that and move towards socialism, China must raise its productivity levels to that of an imperialist core to reduce the working hours and scarcity in social needs, and then end wage labor and monetary exchange. But that will not be possible without a working class revolution in the imperialist core that can establish transitional economies there and then allow the democratic planning of production and distribution globally for social need and not profit. The critique was written in a short letter by Marx 150 years ago. In 2025, it remains just as clear and relevant to our understanding of communism as to our alternatives to capitalism. I like this because it finds a reasonable defense of China while pointing out the flaws of Chinese seemingly constantly stalled transition to socialism. Remember that China declared itself socialist in 1982 when Deng and co rewrote the constitution after the Nothingist faction was removed from power too. So you have it's a gang of four. Then you have Deng and the market socialist, the Bakharnist, and you had the Nothingness Center, which didn't do anything, and thus is barely remembered as being in power from 1978 to 1982. It's often when Westerners talk about it, they just erase it. And you had this need to build productive capacity, but also change social relations. So China's focused on the productive capacity, not as much the social relations. But this is not to say that China's like some dystopian society. I don't think that. I've been there. It seems fine. I mean, some of the air quality in Beijing was pretty shit when I was there, but they're even working on that. So, I have a critical support stance toward, or critical defense, actually, even more support stance towards China. But I'm hesitant to say that it's achieved socialism because their Politburo doesn't even say that, even though their constitution does. And I don't think they can as a state alone, which is why I'm waiting for what the international moves look like. The Belt and Road Initiative is so concerned with not spooking people out with its respect for national sovereignty of any kind of government, not just a socialist one, that it's hard to see how that would form a new international, but it is forming an alternate capitalist development route, which could be the basis of something. Maybe. Neither sinophilia, no sinophobia. Actually, I am kind of culturally sinophilic in ways that some people might find somewhat disturbing, but I have a really dig Chinese history and stuff. I'm on being vague here, but I do think that China is a society that we should defend, but critically. And it is kind of in a stalled transition. And we're transitioning to common ruin here, so I don't know. Who are we to call them out, right? And their populist protections and their semi-social democratic means of protecting their own population is way superior to ours. So on that scale, I'm of very mixed minds. But I agree with Michael Roberts about what the implication of the critique of the Gotha Program in regards to China, Gotha Program, and as applied to China is. All right, protect your peace.